So, good evening, all. On behalf of the four colleges, Rajkumar Keval Ramani Kanya Mahavidyalaya Jaripatka Nagpur, J.M. Patel Arts, Commerce and Science College Bhandara, Vasantrao Naik Government Institute of Arts and Social Sciences Nagpur, and Mahila Mahavidyalaya Nandanvan Nagpur. I welcome you all to this online series of presentations on the syllabus on the program which is prescribed by Rashtrasant Tukaroji Maharaj Nagpur University Nagpur for semester 4 of MA English. The topic for the day is unit 3 of 20th century poetry that includes background topics like surrealism, new apocalyptic writings, movement poets, and the other topics prescribed with the two poets for detailed study, that is Philip Larkin and Seamus Heaney. The resource person for the session is Dr. Somnath Barure. Sir at present is working as assistant professor in English at Vasantrao Naik Government Institute of Arts and Social Sciences, Nagpur. Sir has done his doctoral research on Jayant Mahapatra, to be specific on the Indian landscapes in the poetry of Jayant Mahapatra. That is what he has worked upon. He has 7 international papers, 13 national and 2 state level papers published in the seminars and conferences. Along with that, he has published 29 papers in journals, and the more creditable achievement is that he has 2 books to his credit. One book is on Indian drama and other on the famous dramatist Mahesh Dattani. Along with that, sir has also translated a book from Marathi to English. So on behalf of the organizers and the participating students, I welcome sir to this session and hand over the mic to him for his presentation. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Thank you once again to the organizers for inviting me in this online series of lectures on the syllabus prescribed by Rashtrasant Tukaroji Maharaj Nagpur University, Nagpur. Earlier, I visited this platform to deal with a few units from MA English semester 1, and I'm very happy that again I have been given this opportunity to visit students from all the 4 colleges. Just a minute. So, very good evening to one and all, dear students. We are going to start with the topic, as sir said, from the paper 20th century poetry, and specifically unit 3 I'll be reading from. Before we directly begin reading poetry from unit 3 of the prescribed poets Philip Larkin and Seamus Heaney, we shall have a running sort of survey of the background topics so as to set the tone and read the prescribed poems. It is true that practically the idealism that works behind framing a syllabus and prescribing certain writers, here poets, it's something different. But students at their level, most of the times, they are examination oriented. And I'm sorry, but still this is a bit late to deal with one of the units from your syllabus when exam is approaching and the clock has already begun ticking. Whatever, we have to brush it again, as such topics, they have already been dealt in the individual colleges through various ways, but still, just to remind you people of certain minute details, certain things that may be of use uh, at hand, when the time is approaching, and you will be solving your paper within a few days based on this unit as well. So the two poets we are going to read through their prescribed poems are Philip Larkin and Seamus Heaney. And the background topics we'll be talking about: Surrealism, New Apocalyptic, Moment poets, the group poets, Seamus Heaney, poet of Northern Ireland. Okay. Dear students, before we go through a particular topic, let me remind you that the whole of literature, whole of art, including literature, when we deal with in 20th century, we need to have certain things in mind. First thing is the World War First, World War Second, the period between wars, and the effect of war and the causes of war. Though we are going to read poetry, but much of what shaped poetry in a particular way has certain reasons in the political happenings, in the ideology, in the relations among the various countries, various people, of course, artists, philosophers, theorists, and the way it was happening there in much of Europe and even globally, that need to be taken into account when we deal with literature and especially poetry, which always has, of course, no doubt, the intention to entertain, but more when we talk about poetry in 20th century, poetry in modern period, poetry in postmodern period, or in the first half of 20th century, more particularly, we need to have the critical situation that the entire world had to go through. Many more isms that we have, one of which we are going to deal with surrealism. The period we are going to deal with, this paper is full of isms, like that is Dadaism, Surrealism, Imagism, Symbolism, Modernism, Postmodernism. So many more offshoots of ideologies that we have. And most of them, if you ask me, I would say they are focusing on making you believe that the activities going on in the society, then they are much destructive, and no sane uh, person, no sane artist will allow anything of this kind happen around you, is it? So that is why we have many more isms, uh, in a way criticizing, forbidding, doing something to forbid that thing, making people awake from the darkness that they had, or a sort of inability, it was prevalent all over the world. And you know the poetry that we're going to read is basically from the war period, First World War, that broke in 1914, and the period between two world wars. Slowly, the way we move from Philip Larkin ahead, and we read much of the poetry of Seamus Heaney, the Irish poet. Even those who we are not going to read in this session, but you must have studied from Unit 1. We begin with T.S. Eliot and W.B. Yeats, and then many other poets. Though all of them, they are not there for the detailed study, but through background topics and through a few other poets, mostly major poets from that period. you might have studied. So we begin from Iliad. And here we have in Unit 3, Philip Larkin and Seamus Heaney. While reading poetry by these prescribed poets, we need to have an idea about Surrealism. What this Surrealism is? Surrealism was a cultural movement which developed in Europe in the aftermath of World War I and was largely influenced by Dadaism or Dada. That is one another cultural movement, artistic movement, you can say. During World War I, most of the artists they had to, you know, uh, sought, refuse kind of thing or shelter there in Switzerland. And when such fertile minds they came together, uh, they attempted to have a cross kind of thing of the you know uh, European society is mostly famous for having such platforms where they can gather and can speak about the happenings around the artistic activities that, going on. And like we have coffee houses in Nagpur. Coffee houses there in Europe, they have had a very different history. People used to come there, not in exact way the way it happens with coffee with Karan and chai pe charcha in Indian situation, but they have a different history. So in Switzerland during this First World War period, when these artists they used to gather, they used to think about many more things, and even art, literature, and poetry especially has had a different direction and intention. No doubt was to make people aware of this insane and destructive activity going on throughout the world. So the attempt was to make use of the artistic platform to awaken people, to make them think about the positive side of life and get away from such destructive activities through art. So Surrealism was a cultural movement which developed in Europe in the aftermath of World War I and was largely influenced by Dadaism. So Dadaism continued through Surrealism in the post World War I period. The movement is best known for its virtual artworks and writings and the juxtaposition of distant realities to activate the unconscious mind through the imagery. Imagery, you cannot think of poetry in absence of imagery. And we are talking of the period of imagism, the period of surrealism, wherein imagery plays a very important role. Artists painted unnerving, illogical scenes, sometimes with photographic precision, creating strange creatures from everyday objects. Now, due to lack of time and space, I have not added those photographs. They are easily available. You just type surrealism, and you will have such photographic precisions in painting, and developing painting techniques that allow the unconscious to express itself. Now, one another thing, before I forget, I would like to make it a point in Surrealism, that Surrealism has had one another intention to awaken people, to make them free spiritually and psychologically. Now, how psychology came into discussion when we are talking about poetry and the ideological base through Surrealism by these the originator, especially Andre Breton in Paris, because World War. Now, one such example we have in our time, though it is not war, but it is not less than a war activity we have been going through in the last more than 1.5 years while fighting with coronavirus from March 2019. Actually, in it started there in Wuhan, China, in November, December 2019. So it is not that easy a time. Uh, every third or fourth person, it is said by the global institutions that need, not now but during the lockdowns and all, every third or fourth person in the world was in need of counseling, was in need of some psychological help. So such devastating activities, resulting into making people lose their conscience, lose their mental health. So one such intention of this particular movement was to facilitate, was to offer people in the form of health, so as to make them free psychologically and spiritually. Its aim was, according to leader Andre Breton, to resolve the previously contradictory conditions of dream and reality into an absolute reality, a super reality, or surreality. Leader Breton was explicit in his assertion that surrealism was above all a revolutionary movement. At the time, the movement was associated with political causes, surrealism as a communism and anarchism. The term surrealism is said to have been coined by William Apollinaire as early as in 1917. However, the Surrealist movement was not officially established until October 15, 1920, when the French poet and critic André Breton published the Surrealist Manifesto in Paris. The most important center of the movement was Paris in France. From the 1920s onwards, the movement spread around the globe, impacting the visual arts, literature, film, and music of many countries and languages, as well as political thought and practice, philosophy, and social theory. So, thus was the influence of this particular, uh, ideology, and it left no stone unturned during the post-war, post First World War period. So, from surrealism, let us take a shift to one another background topic. Uh, I'm very much clear that dealing these philosophical ideas, the structural base, something that gave birth to, or here in this session, these ideas will help you understand the poetry that we are going to read, that could be considered as the offshoot of these philosophical ideas. So this is not enough a discussion, but this is not less again, so as to have something to begin with. And uh, if feel interested, later on you people can search for the material. It is already there. When it comes to my classroom, Google Classroom, I shared this much earlier. So I hope our students, they might have gone through uh, the topics we're dealing with much earlier. So new apocalyptic, the term new apocalyptics were a poetry grouping in the United Kingdom in the 1940s. Then we were talking about 1920s, and here we are talking about 1940s. Slowly we are moving ahead in 20th century, taking their name from the anthology The New Apocalypse, published in 1939, which was edited by J.F. Henry and Henry Truss. Aesthetically, apocalypticism dealt in nightmarish images, engaged with mythology, and meditated on war. Politically, it tended towards anarchism. Their reaction against the political realism of much of the 30s poetry drew support upon D.H. Lawrence, its Apocalypse in 1931, Surrealism, and Expressionism. Others closely associated were the Scottish, as Henry was, poets Fraser and Norman Macrae. although the latter saw his work from red lights onwards as part of the long haul towards lucidity after his apocalyptic start. The other poets in this group were Nicholas Moore, Philip O'Connor, Leslie Phillips, Tom Scott, Graves Stewart, Dylan Thomas, Vernon Watkins, and Peter Wells. So you just have this idea in mind what the apocalyptic is. It is a poetry grouping in United Kingdom in the 1940s, and it focused on, or it dealt with nightmarish images, engaged with mythology, and meditated on war. And the third background topic from your syllabus is the another group of poets popularly known as movement poets. Anger as a force in 1950s. Philip Larkin, especially we are going to read from this group. Literature had its origin in a group known as the Movement, deeply English in outlook. The Movement was a gathering of poets including Philip Larkin, Kingsley Amis, Elizabeth Jennings, Tom Gunn, John Wayne, DJ Enright, and Robert Conquest. You just have these names in mind. The movement can be seen as an aggressive, skeptical, patriotic backlash against the cosmopolitan elites of the 1930s and 1940s. Much of protest that we are reading, whether in the form of surrealism, dadaism, imagism, or the previous topic, it is against the established politics, having been influenced or influential during that period globally. So the movement can be seen as an aggressive, skeptical, patriotic backlash against the cosmopolitan elites of 30s and 40s. The poets in the group rejected modernism, avant-garde experimentation, romanticism, and the metaphorical fireworks of poets such as Dylan Thomas. Their verse was ironical, down to earth, unsentimental, and rooted in a nostalgic idea of English identity. One another thing that could be used as a tool, as and when you read, as and when you attempt to understand poetry. That one poetic school, and when the another comes, that comes with difference in opinion, and most of the times it attempts to give a break and come out with something new. Sometimes, of course, they have had something from the period before, isn't it? Like we have classical poetry and we have neoclassical poetry as well, from 17th and 18th century. So the moment here, participants were Oxbridge educated. Now, when we talk of the movement poets, they are Oxford and Cambridge educated people, means they were educated. White, predominantly male, and Jennings was the only woman in the group, and she was a late arrival. Middle class, Europhobic, and most part heterosexual. Means that was a group of poets. Majority of them, they were heterosexual. So a bit different, kind of experiences you are likely to read by these poets. Even so, they caught the mood of their time, and Larkin and Amis, in particular, are undeniably major figures in English literature. The title of the group was coined in 1954 by the literary editor of The Spectator, J.D. Scott. He referred to this new movement of the 50s. The movement produced two anthologies: Enright's Poets of the 1950s, published in 1955, and Conquest's New Lines in 1956. But while Amis achieved some success as part of the group, with his poetry. It was his debut novel, Lakizim, uh, very popular, uh, with a new kind of hero, anti-hero. Lakizim, the novel was published in 1954, which secured his reputation. With the novel's central character Zim Dixon, Amis gave English literature an unlikely new hero, one who was very much in the tune with the modern age. Okay. Second last or next background topic that we have, that is group poets. We shall have just a passing reference to. The group was an informal group of poets who met in London from the mid 1950s to the mid 1960s as a poetic movement in Great Britain. It is often seen as being the successor to the movement. This is a group of poets who find it possible to meet and discuss each other's work helpfully and without backbiting or backscratching. We have no eggs to grind. This isn't a gang, and there is no monolithic body of doctrine to which everyone must subscribe. Simply speaking, this group, intended to be together, intended to meet, frequently, so as to help one another, so as to discuss what is it going on in their time, and to help, one another, so as to come out with new ideas. The poets who met included George Macbeth, Edward Lewis, Smith Philip, Hobsbawm, Peter Redrow, Alan Bronjon, Peter Porter, and Martin Bell. Ted Hughes occasionally attended, but the most known in the academia, being there in the syllabus of most of the graduate and postgraduate syllabuses. Louis Smith and Hobsbawm edited a group anthology published by London Oxford University Press 1963. In the foreword, the aim is described of writing frank autobiographical poems and a poetry of direct experience. As you people are going to uh, face the examination, and this examination being of the kind of objective, you need to remember these anthologies, because after all, when it is to account the success of a particular poet, success of a particular group of poets, of course, the way they have been featured in these milestone anthologies of poetry, so possibility is more that you may have at least one or two questions with the title of the anthologies from the respective periods. So a group anthology is one such. In the anthology's epilogue, Hobsbawm writes of the importance of discussion and the writer's need for community to keep him in touch with his audience. Means most of the times poetry speaks of isolation, poetry speaks of that liberty through isolation, being away, or maintaining distance from the society. But something unusual that we have in this example of group poets, that how to relate, how to connect, or how to be in communion with the society. Writer's need for community to keep him in touch with his audience was the agenda of this particular group. Now Seamus Heaney, though we are going to read poetry by Heaney, but as this has been prescribed in the background topic as well, we shall have some passing references of Heaney as a poet of Northern Ireland. Seamus Heaney is widely recognized as one of the major poets of the 20th century. A native of Northern Ireland, Heaney was raised in County Derry and later lived for many years in Dublin. He was the author of over 20 volumes of poetry and criticism and edited several widely used anthologies. He won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1995 for works of lyrical beauty and ethical depth. which exalt everyday miracles and the living past. And he taught at Harvard University from 1985 to 2006 and served as the Oxford Professor of Poetry from 89 to 94. He died in 2013. Now we are talking of one such a crucial poet from Ireland who speaks of the Irish identity. Of course, you people have studied W.B. Yeats, one another uh, important pillar when we talk of poetry in 20th century, especially representation of poetic identity of the nation Ireland. Of course, the names that come forward of W.B. Yeats and Seamus Heaney. Heaney has attracted a readership on several continents and has won prestigious literary awards and honors, including the Nobel Prize. As Blake Morrison noted in his work Seamus Heaney, the author, that rare thing a poet rated highly by critics and academics, yet popular with the common reader. Part of Heaney's popularity stems from his subject matter, modern Northern Ireland, its farms and cities best with civil strife, its natural culture and language overrun by English rule. Now, when we are introducing the poet, uh, I cannot, stop myself from referring to one of his, prescribed poems, uh, whether it is, Requiem for Poppies or, another one wherein, the poet speaks of his childhood memories, the liberty that he enjoyed, and mostly the poet, compares and contrasts, the situation and the things like the wells and the water pumps during his childhood, and how from memories of childhood the poet composes the poem so as to find some solution, at least entertain himself in when he's grown up, and has had many more difficulties, confusions, and sort of uh, backlash, you can say, in his life as a poet, but more than a poet, the representer, a political figure, because Henny can also be studied as the influencer in the Irish movement. So the New York Review of Books essayist Richard Murphy described Cheney as the poet who has shown the finest art in presenting a coherent vision of Ireland, past and present. And his poetry is known for its oral beauty and finely wrought textures. Often described as a regional poet, he is also traditionalist who deliberately gestures back towards the pre-modern worlds of William Wordsworth and John Clare. And he was born and raised in Kesselson, County Derry, Northern Ireland. The impact of his surroundings and the details of his upbringing on his work are immense. As a Catholic in Protestant Northern Ireland, Henny once described himself in the New York Times Book Review as someone who emerged from a buried life and entered the realm of education. Okay, so that was it. I jot down certain points so that you people will have a perfect start so as to you know uh, have something solid in mind before you start reading the prescribed poems. Now, out of those two prescribed poets, let us begin chronologically with Philip Larkin, who was born on August 9, 1922, and you know uh, he left for his heavenly abode on December 2nd, 1985. Almost more than 35, 36 years, have passed since we lost this poet. But still, He is accompanying us in the academic discussions, academic circles, academic journey uh, through Indian and the global universities. Philip Larkin was an English poet, novelist, and librarian. His first book of poetry, The North Sea, was published in 1945, followed by two novels, Jill in 46 and A Girl in Winter in 47. And he came to prominence in 1955 with the publication of his second collection of poems, The Less Deceived, followed by the Whitsun Weddings. Now, some two, three poems out of its four published poems, they have been taken from the famous The Whitsun Wedding, published in 1964, and High Windows, 1974. One I think out of four is from The Less Deceived, and all three from the Whitsun Weddings. So I will not go into detail talking about the books in his credit. After graduating from Oxford University in 1943 with a first in English language literature, Larkin became a librarian. And how Larkin's professional life, peeps out through his poetic compositions, that has been, described, that has been composed and created with, very appropriate imagery, uh, creature imagery, you can say, or animal image, not exactly animal. We have, a sequel in the name Toads and Toads Revisited. We don't have Toads in this paper, but Toads Revisited, which is a sequel, sequel amphibian. Now, with the help of, such unusual imagery, this poet Philip Larkin expresses, his disgust, something that he has in his mind, maybe as a part of his work as a librarian. So it was during the 30 years he worked with distinct as university librarian at the Brainbar Jones Library at the University of Hull, that produced the greater part of his published work. His poems are marked by what and motion falls, a very English glum accuracy about emotions, places, and relationships. What Donald Davy described as lowered sights and diminished expectations. Larkin was influenced by W.H. Auden, W.B. Yeats, and Thomas Hardy. His poems are highly structured but flexible in verse forms. The moment to describe the dominant trend in British post-war literature. Poems by Larkin were included in the 1953 Pen Anthology that also featured poems by Amis and Robert Conquest, and Larkin was seen to be a part of this grouping. The first poem by Philip Larkin we shall go through. I won't be able to read the entire poem, but as poetry is there for loud reading, I cannot, exclude, or just, neglect some piece of poem by these poets. So you be particular about, the reading of poetry, and even if I miss, even if I, avoid reading certain parts of the poetry, you don't do it, while going through. At least before you go for exam, read these poems first, and then you just be there. The Whitsun Wedding. That Whitsun, I was late getting away, not till about 1:20 on the sunlit Saturday. Did my three-quarters empty train pull out? All windows down, all cushions hot, all sense of being in a hurry gone. We ran behind the backs of houses, crossed a street of blinding windscreens, smelled the fish docks, thence the river's level drifting breadth began, where Skye and Lincolnshire and water meet. All afternoon, through the tall heat that slept for miles inland, a slow and stopping curve southwards we kept. White farms went by, short shadowed cattle and canals with floating of industrial froth. A hothouse flashed uniquely, hedge dipped and rose, and now and then a smell of grass displaced the reek of buttoned carriage, clothed until the next town, new and nondescript, approached with acres of dismantled cars. At first, I didn't notice what a noise the weddings made. Each station that we stopped at, sun destroys the interest of what's happening in the shade. And down the long pole platforms, hooks and skulls, I took for porters larking with the mails and went on reading. Once we start, though, we passed them, braining and pomaded girls in parodies of passion, heels and veils, all posed irresolutely, watching us go as if out on the end of an event, waving goodbye. To something that survived it, struck, I learned more promptly out next time, more curiously, and saw it all again in different terms. The fathers with broad belts under their suits and seeming of reheads, mothers loud and fat, an uncle shouting smut, and then the perms, the nylon gloves and jewelry substitutes, the lemons, bows, and olive orchards that marked off the girls unreally from the rest. Yes, from cafes and banquet halls, up yards and bunting dressed. Coach party annexes, the wedding's days were coming to an end. All down the line, fresh couples climbed abroad. The rest stood around. The last confetti and advice were thrown. And as we moved, each face seemed to define just what it saw departing. Children frowned at something dull fathers had never known. Success so huge and wholly farcical, the women shared the secret like a happy funeral, while girls, gripping their handbags tighter, stared at the religious wounding, free at last, and loaded with the sum of all they saw. We hurried towards London, shuffling gouts of steam. Now fields were building plots and poplars cast long shadows over major roads, and for some 50 minutes, that in time would seem just long enough to settle hats and say, I nearly died. A dozen marriages got underway. They watched the landscape sitting side by side, and Odeon went past a cooling tower, and someone running up to bow, and none thought of the others they would never meet, or how their lives would all contain this hour. I thought of London spread out in the sun, its postal districts packed like squares of wheat. There we were aimed, and as we raced across bright knots of rain, past standing pullmans, walls of blackened moss came close, and it was nearly done, this frail traveling coincidence, and what it held stood ready to be loosed with all the power that being changed can give. We showed again, and as the tightened brakes took hold, they swelled. A sense of falling, like an arrow shot sent out of sight somewhere, becoming rain. Now, this bit long poem, Larkin, in a very different manner. If you look at, the whole poem, we have, a sort of shifts, something that begins, describing the landscape, describing the journey, because the poet, as we have seen in the introduction itself, is a professional. He's a librarian, and in this particular poem, we have, one of his journeys on one such Saturday, and the day is famous, as the Whitsun Day, and there in England. most of the middle class and lower middle class people who may not afford, or they just want to avoid paying taxes on marriage to the government. That is a day when all these taxes are waived every year. So many more people they get married so as to get benefited of the waiver scheme. So this one is the poet's experience on that day when he's boarding a train, and in first one, two or three stanzas, he speaks of the journey. He speaks of the landscape, speaks of the happenings and various things that he sees from the window outside. But suddenly the poet's conscience awakens, and then he shifts from the landscape to the custom, for the the uh, marriage tradition that he has in his society, and a completely negative approach that we see. uh, a skeptic, you can say. Larkin is a skeptic, and he represents that group, that ideology through poetry. So the poet keeps speaking about the custom of marriage, the way that takes place, the kind of practices people follow, elderly people especially. They keep guiding the newly married couples. So each and every minute detail of the appearance and of the suggestions we see through this poem. But ultimately he ends positively by saying a sense of falling like an arrow shot sent out of sight somewhere becoming rain. Isn't it? Means though, however, this custom of marriage is insane nonsense, but still for the continuity of human race, the poet says that the foolishness of getting married or carrying on these activities is necessary. He accepts and sums up his uh, description in the poem. The poem is about the poet's own journey to London on the Whitsun day. On this day, people from lower class, as I told, in the beginning, the poet seems to be showing a kind of hatred for marriage or the sorry newly married couples. Therefore, his description of physical appearances of those couples and their relatives is full of mockery. But towards the end of the poem, the poet realizes the importance of marriage, and the last couplet that we have read recently. The new knowledge contradicts his previous attitude towards marriage. It results in a kind of irony which affects the poet himself. Therefore, the poem becomes self-ironic. The first two stanzas bring the physical descriptions of the landscape traveled by the train. The boarding of train by newly married people creates contrast in description by the poet in the earlier part. Last observation in this poem, the poet, after the description of the wedding couples and their relatives, once again focuses on scenes outside landscape. Because mostly the poem speaks of, journey from one particular place to London. And everything, even the appearance of the landscape that has been described by the poet in such a way, the rivers he speaks in a very systematic manner. Just a distraction that happens in description is because of these couples and their relatives. The description can be contrasted to the description of the landscape. The turning point in the poem comes to an end, showing by the lines a sense of falling like an arrow shot sent out of sight. Somewhere becomes rain. In these lines, the poet expresses his realization of the importance of the custom of marriages. Not by going deep into just one poem, as we are supposed to read eight. Toads Revisited is the another poem by Philip Larkin, and walking around in the park should feel better than the work. The lake, the sunshine, the grass to lie on. Blurred playground, noises beyond black stockings, nurses. Not a bad place to be. It doesn't suit me. Being one of the men you meet of an afternoon, palsied old step takers, hair-eyed clerks with the zitters, waxed, fleshed out patients, still vague from accidents, and characters in long coats deep in the litter baskets, all dozing the toad work by being stupid or weak. Think of being dumb, hearing the hours chime, watching the bread delivered, the sun by clouds covered, the children going home. Think of being dumb, turning over their failures by some bed of lobeliers. Nowhere to go but indoors. No friends but empty chairs. No, give me my in tray, my loaf haired secretary, my shell. I keep the call in, sir. What else can I answer? When the lights come on at 4 at the end of another year, give me your arm, old toad. Help me down Cemetery Road. When I'm there to analyze this a bit different, something that the poet, wishes to put forth using a metaphor. Toad. Toads are repulsive and unpleasant creatures, which are an analogy or metaphor for work and its poisonous influence on life. Something that has become redundant, something, boring. In the original poem, these creatures squat on life of the persona, suggesting that they took up residence where they were not, you know, welcomed, you can say. And a toad also existed inside the persona, a fatal character flaw that prevents them from leaving work. Toad's Revisited starts with the speaker walking around in the park on what supposedly a day of work to the persona. This should be a restful and joyous. However, the word should implies that that is not the reality of the situation. Whilst lake and sunshine are serene examples of nature, and the other outside noises simply blurred so as not to intrude on the speaker's space. It doesn't suit them. Surroundings are not bad, but are also not interesting enough to warrant vast amount time spent there. The poem then goes on to describe the men that the persona would hate to be, that you meet of an afternoon who are all the same with nothing to do, isn't it? When the work is not interesting, when the work, is more as a compulsion and less as something willingly been accepted. So toad is always there to symbolize that particular situation. The poem then goes on to describe when men that persona would hate to be the that you meet of an afternoon who are all the same with nothing to do. Larkin describes each of these groups of men as dozing, work purposefully making contribution to society. However, this disdain and view of them as stupid and weak, both snobbish and ironic, as a people have a valid reason for being unemployed and are closer to death than the persona, whilst they live their lives watching events. People pass by, the children going home. This is because there is no other alternative for them. Some are too ill to work or have no way through which to find a job. Now, this situation, the poet sees at various levels. On one side, he speaks of, those who are in some job but due to some reason, it is not that, enchanting. It is not that, entertaining. But still they are, contributing in one way or the other. And on the other side, you know look at, these. She says, turning over their failures by some bed of lovely airs, nowhere to go but indoors, no friends but empty chairs. Watching the bread delivered. No, give me my in tray, my loaf-haired secretary. My, shall I keep the call in, sir? What else can I answer? Because everything has been decided. No option, isn't it? And the other is nowhere, means they are not, getting given the opportunity to uh, be a part of, this though meaningless activity. In the next form, the explosion, Larkin, takes us to a different height from where he describes and in a way expresses and exhibits his concerns for, certain things happening around him as an individual. On the day of explosion, shadows pointed towards the pithead. In the sun, the slack heap slept. Down the lane came men in pit boots, puffing oat-aged talk and pipe smoke, shouldering off the freshened silence. Especially when you read, at home, that time you try to focus on each and every image that is been used by the poet. When he's talking of explosion, of course, it is, something from, the mining, area. So the image of pit boots, the image of, sped, no, and such laborers, they being, used to, smoking and all. The poet makes it a point during his description. One chased after rabbits, lost them, came back with a nest of larks' eggs, showed them, lodged them in the grasses. So they passed in a beards and moleskins. Fathers, brothers, nicknames, laughter. Through the tall gates standing open, at noon there came a tremor. Cows stopped chewing for a second, sun scarfed as in heat has dimmed. The dead go on before us. They are sitting in God's house in comfort. We shall see them face to face. Plain as lettering in the chapels. It was said, and for a second, wives saw men of the explosion. Larger than in life, they managed, gold as on a coin or walking somehow from the sun towards them, on showing the eggs unbroken. Now, this very small poem, written in, tercets, means every stanza has got 3 lines. The poet, uh, fantastically, shapes, composes the idea of explosion, how it, happens, but how positively he ends. Even in explosion, he says, one showing the eggs unbroken. The positive side, that something, maybe life, you know, uh, the second or third last stanza, where the dead go on before us, they are sitting in God's house in comfort, because the house that was, offered was not comfortable. Larkin here, speaks of, the pathos, the, inequality, atrocities, exploitation of laborers that, keep taking place, uh, everywhere. And in one such, event of destruction, maybe because of, the dangerous atmosphere, it is there in the mines, or the inadequate facilities to tackle with, such you know difficulties, such mishaps in the industry, uh, that has been exposed through explosion by Philip Larkin. Plain as lettering in the chapels, it was said, and for a second, wild saw men of the explosion. Means when, some worker is going for work, every day. It is such a routine kind of activity for them. Plain as lettering in the chapels, it was said, and for a second, wives saw men of the explosion. Means perhaps they may not have had any such idea that somebody who goes for office every day, somebody who goes on work for every day, but on such unusual day, wives saw men of explosion. Means the dead men, perhaps. Larger than in life, they managed gold as on fine or walking somehow from the sun towards them, on showing the eggs unbroken. Isn't it? Now the image of eggs unbroken, perhaps is the uh, continuity of life, working, isn't it? Perhaps another man, working in that same way. The poet, makes it a point. The explosion is a short poem of 25 lines made up of 8 unrhymed tercets and a final isolated one-line stanza. The speaker of the poem is an observer and commentator on the crucial event of the poem, an explosion at a mine. The language is clearly, you people can read this one, isn't it? Not by wasting your time. I'll just, take one or two passing remarks on, this particular poem. The language, yes, it is significant that the poet Philip Larkin does not describe the actual explosion, but rather its effect on the outer world, with the tremor, cows stop shaving, and the sun is dimmed. Readers do not see its effect on the miners for dying under the earth. That horror and suffering is hidden from view clearly. It is not what Larkin is interested in about the event. The wives of the dead miners see their men in a new way. Larger than in life, they managed after this transformation. The final line of the poem recalls the miners as they were and as they are, one showing that eggs unbroken, their lives and their deaths were a harmonious, unbroken whole. The poet is, interested in exhibiting, voicing the ethos of, the mind workers. And last poem by Philip Larkin, it is Ambulances. Closed like confessionals, they thread loud noons of cities, giving back none of the glances they absorb. Light glossy gray, arms on a plate, they come to rest at any curb. All streets in time are visited. Now the poem goes like, a riddle, isn't it? It goes like a riddle, that what is it, perhaps he's going to ask. Then children strewn on steps or road, or women coming from the shops, past smells of different dinners. See a wild what, but a wild white face that overtops. Red stretcher, blankets momently as it is carried in and stored, and sense the solving emptiness that lies just under all we do, and for a second get it whole. So permanent and blank and true, the fastened doors reset. Poor soul, they whisper at their own distress. For borne away in deadened air, may go the sudden shut of loss, round something nearly at an end, and what cohered it in it across. The years, the unique random blend of families and fashions there, at last begin to loosen, far from the exchange of love to light, unreachable inside a room. The traffic paths to let go by brings closer what is left to come and dull to distance all we are. A very common kind of experience. Many of us, we do, you know, have such experiences of, crossing, overtaking, or just passing by, these ambulances. And mostly we try to avoid, even to look at. Most particularly during the Corona period, those who are in very much hurry all the times on roads, they too, you know, uh, keep aside and give way to the passing ambulances, mostly carrying the plastic bagged dead bodies, carrying no relatives, nobody. accompanying. So such you know in a way something dangerous, a symbol of death. These ambulances, how they look, has been looked down upon by the poet in this particular poem. In general, most of okay. Krishna Veni,
वो तूने किसके लिए छोड़ दिया वो?
will you please
डैडी को दे दे।
mute yourself?
वो देखो सब्जी जो
Okay. In general, most of Larkin's poems leaned towards the myopic and the miserable, and it is no wonder to discover that as Larkin grew older, his focus in writing turned from exploration of the minute of living towards a rumination on death. Although he had covered the topic in one way or another throughout previous works, later poems of him, such as Ambulances, gave it a far more nuanced look. Larkin was fascinated by the idea of the human condition. Death is a part of that condition, and its randomness, closeness, and inevitability are all themes that Larkin found especially interesting to analyze. Ambulances is one such poem written for the collection, The Whitby Weddings. Ambulances is an exploration of the pervading sense of death that occurs in constrained societies, in cities. Spatially, death is ever present due to the differing age of the population, the inherent risk of city life, and other factors. Although nowadays death is far less common than it was in, say, the medieval era, there is still a stigma and a fear surrounding the question of death, and it is perhaps this reason that led Larkin to explore it in poetic form. Ambulances follows the route of an ambulance through rush hour in the city, chartering its course and its meaning. Now, we don't have that time to discuss line by line, but one thing the poet very interestingly in the sense, something that he cannot help himself talk about, because it is the human tendency that human beings are very much worried about the uh, all pervasive or something that you cannot avoid kind of reality in life of each one is the death factor, and we try to avoid speaking about, facing about, even having a look of death being carried in ambulances. So this particular topic, the poet somewhere uh, uses and he describes. Now the another poet, I will not waste time in talking about Seamus Heaney, because we have seen him there in background topic itself. So we shall make a shift from Philip Larkin and his last poem Ambulances to the first poem by Requiem by Seamus Heaney in the name Requiem for the Trophies. The pockets of our greatcoats full of barley. Comparatively, these poems are very small, but with a huge message. The pockets of our greatcoats full of barley, no kitchens on the run, no striking camp. We moved quick and sudden in our own country. The priest lay behind ditches with the tramp. A people hardly marching on the hike. We found new tactics happening each day. We would cut through reins and rider with the pipe and stampede cattle into infantry. Then retreat through hedges where cavalry must be thrown until on Vinegar Hill the fatal conflict. Terraced thousands died, shaking Sids at Kinnan. The hillside bloodshed soaked in our broken wave. They buried us without shroud or coffin, and in August, the barley grew up out of the grave. Oh, when I was reading this poem, for second, third time for this presentation. I could not resist my temptation to speak about one very good Hollywood movie named The Last Samurai, featuring the warrior community there in Japan, and for a longer period, for almost more than 700 years, this community was given the responsibility to fight for and protect the king of Japan. So in the Last Samurai, there is one scene when the last samurai, uh, you know, had to fight a war with the culprits from the palace, and they were there to, misguide the king as well, and taking help of, the colonizers, Britishers, these traditional warriors, as if they were to commit suicide, they make an attempt, and the way they are, dead later in the movie, when the American captain, he is there to return that sword of respect. That was a responsibility. Perhaps the forefathers of the present king of Japan in the movie, one who witnessed, one who became a reason for the fall of such traditional community, such brave community. And when he asked that, tell me how he died, the last samurai, the American, captain says, sir, I won't tell you how he died, but I can tell you how he lived and how he, kept doing his duties till the last moment of his life. So the poet here again, makes it a point through his poetic composition that how the ordinary Irishmen, they too had a dream, and so as to make that dream come true, they fought with such ready, uh, trained, and with ammunition, cavalry. They had to fight, and of course the result was their death. But being in death, how the poet speaks of them, how were they? The pockets of our great coats full of barley, they had no kitchen, isn't it? And even otherwise, when you are there on the war front, possibility of getting enough of food, proper food, is very rare. So they had, their food in the form of barley in their pockets. No kitchens on the run, no striking camp. We moved quick and sudden in our own country. The priest lay behind ditches with the tramp. The people hardly marching on the hike. We found new tactics happening each day. We would cut through reins in rider with the pike and stampede cattle into infantry, then retreat through hedges when cavalry must be thrown, until on Vinegar Hill, the fatal conclave. Vinegar Hill, is a hill there in Ireland where, the conclave, fatal conclave took place, wherein terrorist thousands died, shaking seeds and cannons. The hillside blushed, soaked in a broke wave, the kind of tactics used by the British army, the royal army, so as to kill them, butcher them, and call it off the Irish rebellion. They buried us without shroud or coffin, isn't it? So as to highlight the cruelty used by the winners. And in August, the barley grew up out of the grave, isn't it? The remaining seeds of barley, physically speaking, the denotation in the lines, those barley seeds, they grew up. But perhaps the poet is talking about something that these thousands of men who died for doing nothing, isn't it? For protecting their own lives, protecting their own nation, they sacrifice their lives. And sacrifice of any such person never goes unsung, isn't it? Perhaps, many other people, they could, have inspiration from the sacrifices made by these men. And in August, the barley grew up out of the grave, isn't it? The continuity of, that uh, spirit against the colonizers that continued, perhaps the poet suggests through this form. Additionally, before beginning this piece, a reader should know that the word crop is included very prominently in the title. References the rebels who were marked by their very short hair. This word gives the reader much of what they need to know about the poem, especially when it is tied together with requiem, a word used to refer to a token of remembrance, or more specifically, a kind of Catholic mass for the souls of the dead. So the term requiem for the Croppies again is a religious term, and the mass is used to cover the face of the dead person in Catholic religion. Exposure by Seamus Heaney is the second poem. As we are running short of time, uh, same way, we shall just read this poem in part. Exposure. It is December in Wicklow, alders dripping birches, inheriting the last light, the ash tree cold to look at. A comet that was lost should be visible at sunset. Those million tons of light, like a glimmer of haws and rose hips. And I sometimes see a falling star. If I could come on meteorite, instead I walk through damp leaves, husks, the spent flukes of autumn, amazing a hero on some muddy compound. His gifts like a sling stone, viruled for the desperate. How did I end up like this? I often think of my friends. Beautiful prismatic counseling and the anvil brains of some who hate me as I sit weighing and weighing my responsible prestige. For what? For the fear, for the people, for what is said behind backs. Rain comes down through the alders, its low conductive voices mutter about letdowns and erosions, and each drop recalls. The diamond absolutes, am neither internee nor informer, an inner, grown, long haired, and thoughtful, a woodcur, escaped from the massacre, taking protective coloring from the bole and bark filling every wind that blows. Who blowing up these sparks for their meager heat have missed the once in a lifetime portent, the comet's pulsing rose. This poem discusses the poet's role in a society that is treating itself apart, and how he might contribute helpfully to the discourse of the time. As we know, that Seamus Heaney had a major role to play in the War of Independence, the Irish, Civil War, and the poet played a major role, key role, though a poet, but has had a very, influential role to play in the political world. But there came a time when he had to, leave his, area, as we talked about, while introducing, that he is a poet of, Northern Ireland. But when he is in Wicklow, which is, a city southward, to Dublin, the poem begins with the speaker describing the weather in Wicklow. This was the Irish town that Penny chose to move to. It was a self-imposed exile that he later compared with Ovid's exile from Rome. Together, these two poets were trying to work from apart to the influence their homes. The speaker moves through different layers of doubt in his own ability, touches on moments of heroism, and finally concludes with the determination to what he can to improve the situation his people are in Ireland. So the idea behind this composition is to search, investigate, the possible ways how he can improve the situation back at home in Ireland. In the first lines of exposure, the speaker begins by stating that the setting is Wicklow in the month of December. Wicklow is a country to the south of Dublin, Ireland. The speaker is outside looking around at the way the cold season is impacting the various plants and trees. No doubt, winter is a season of death there in the Western world, and in the English, islands, isn't it? Most prominently, this could be seen through, poetry and even, through other literary works of art. Just from these first lines, the tone is set for the rest of the poem. It is solemn and in parts truly depressing. The scenery is gloomy, covered in the frosts of winter, and it leaches from the plants into penny. The world seems to be against him. The speaker explains that at sunset, at the end of his time in exile, he will be seen as million tons of light. No, in the first few lines, we see that there is a reference to, you know, a meteorite, and before that to a falling, star, isn't it? So, million tons of light. His personal power as a human being, specifically as a writer, will help him light up the natural scene he's simply living in at this point. In the final four lines, the speaker concludes the text and re emphasizes the importance of his role. He is meant to be a kind of arbitrator within his people. The lines and the idea of blowing up sparks and missing the once in a lifetime potent, the pulsing rose of the comet, speak to the still present separation between the speaker and his ideal self, as well as those he wants to help. So the poem, keeps revolving around the, you know, ideal kind of situation that the poet has, or a sort of estimate of his own, ideal estimate of his own, and the present situation, and of course, whether in ideal situation or in the reality, the poet, the Seamus Heaney keeps talking about the well-being of his people. So it keeps revolving around himself, his dream, and the reality that he is going through. So this is one very short but philosophical poem. Equally famous is Bogland by Simonsini, or it is a representative poem of the Irish history, Irish legends, Irish past, you can say. We have no prairies to slice a big sun at evening. Everywhere the eye concedes to encourage encroaching horizon is wood into the cyclops eye of a town. Our unfenced country is bog that keeps crusting between the sights of the sun. They have taken the skeleton of the great Irish elk out of the field, set it up, an astounding crate full of air. Butter sunk under more than 100 years was recovered salty and white. The ground itself is kind, black butter, melting and opening underfoot. Missing its last definition by millions of years, they will never dig coal here. Only the waterlogged trunks of great firs, soft as pulp, our pioneer keep striking inward and downwards. Every layer they strip seems camped on before. The bog holes might be Atlantic seepage, the wet center is bottomless. Now, simply not by going into details of the analysis of this particular poem, we need to understand the conflict that we have continuously in 20th century through various poets, Eliot and now it is Seamus Heaney. They keep posing the question of conflict between England and Ireland and how they have been looted. Even one such reference we have through the pages of history. We have one home rule movement in the Indian history during the War of Independence, and it was an Irish woman, Annie Besant, who came all the way from Ireland to England and extended her help in establishing one such platform of opposing the Britishers, isn't it? So there is a historical evidence that this friendship of Indian and Irish people that resulted in creating history in the form of bagging the once ever Nobel Prize for Literature to Rabindranath Tagore, and again a token of love of the friendship between W.B. Yeats and Tagore himself. So coming back to Bogland, perhaps Bogland symbolizes extortion, exploitation, and a sort of loot that he makes it a point through various images. They they have taken the skeleton of the great Irish elk out of the peat, set it up, an astounding crate full of air, butter sunk under more than 100 years, was recovered salty and white. Perhaps something that was there in the form of riches, the you know resources, minerals, they have been extracted. More than 100 years was recovered salty and white. The ground itself is kind black butter, melting and opening underfoot, missing its last definition by millions of years. They will never dig coal here. Only the waterlogged trunks of great firs, soft as pulp, our pioneers keep striking inwards and downwards. Every layer they strip seems camped on before. The bog holes might be Atlantic seepage. The wet center is bottomless. Means the British government, the British king perhaps, queen, extracted everything that they had in the name of minerals. We have no prairies. A sort of comparison with which the poet began. He's talking of the North American areas where the you know uh, natural resources are full. The landscape is such vast where prairies is stands for such grassy lands where things are very easily available. So the Irish landscape is not the landscape of the kind of prairies there in Northern America. So every layer they strip seems camped on before, and the bog holes might be Atlantic seepage. The wet center is bottomless. A sort of plight that we see about the loss of his own country, loss of their culture, loss of their identity. Bogland is one of many poems Henny composed on the subject of Irish identity and its relation to the past. It was written in 1960s and the last poem in his second book, Door into the Dark. Again, I'll skip this part of analysis. You can read this from my presentation. Now, Henny's another poem is Personal Helicon, uh, equally popular. As a child, they could not keep me from bells, even when I was introducing the poet. How he is, a regional poet, how he is an Irish poet, how he, speaks of the Irish identity, that has become identity of his own. As a child, he says, they could not keep me from bells and old pumps with buckets and windlasses. I loved the dark drop. the trapped sky, the smells of waterweed, fungus, and dank moss. One in a brickyard with a rotted board top. I say board, the rich crash when a bucket plummeted down at the end of a rope. So deep you saw on reflection in it. A shallow one under a dry stone ditch, fructified like any aquarium. When you dragged out long roots from the soft mulch, a white pace forward over the bottom. Others had echoes, gave back your own call with a clean new music in it, and one was scarce for there, out of ferns and tall, fox blows, a rat slapped across my reflection. Now, to pry into roots, to finger slime, to stare big-eyed narcissus into some spring is beneath all adult dignity. I rhyme to see myself, to set the darkness echoing. Now, this is something very different in the sense the poet, uses, the image. Personal Helicon was written by the poet Henny and published in Henny's first major collection, Death of a Naturalist, in 1966. Like many, the poem in this collection draws on Henny's experiences growing up in rural Northern Ireland. The poem speaker describes the joy, wonder, and curiosity felt while exploring old wells and water pumps as a child. Helicon refers to mountain in Greece that in ancient mythology was home to two sad springs deemed the source of poetic inspiration. The poem suggests that speaker's childhood experiences became the source of his own poems and inspiration, his own Helicon. For the speaker, as the poem goes on to make clear, the source of inspiration is not the remote springs of a mythical mountain, but rather the immediate wells and old water pumps of his childhood. Far from being lofty or idealized, these wells had a rotted board top or were shallow under a dry stone ditch. They were surrounded by the local plants of the landscape, including ferns and tall foxgloves, and even included a rat that slapped over the speaker's reflection in the water. Now, the idealized part apart, uh, the reference to these traditional wells, the foxgloves, the ferns, the rats, is to make you people understand, though physically he's speaking of the things he refers, but actually the poem focuses on poetic process, poetic inspiration on the part of the poet. What is it that inspires a poet to write about? And he says it is not always something absurd that we have in life, but it is something, uh, he says that something that is local, something that is very close to yourself, your own experience, isn't it? Immediate, something that is very immediate in your life. The poet says inspires, and that we need to keep, uh, as a source of inspiration. And for that, we need not, step out and look at, things from outside. Uh, this is what I would uh, like to say uh, about the poems prescribed. Of course, this discussion is not enough. For that, you need to read once again the poems prescribed and uh, be there always, with new ideas, new understanding. Uh, Thank you, and wish you all the best for examination. The uh, question bank that I have shared yesterday, of course, might have reached you, and many more questions I have given on both the units, unit number 2 and unit number 3. So hopefully After reading the text, you will go through before you go for examination. Thank you. Thank you, organizers, for inviting me and giving this platform to have dialogue with students in these hours of crisis. Thank you. Thank you very much, sir.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir.
Okay.
So, on behalf of the organizing team, the organizing colleges, and all the students who were present or who will be viewing this on YouTube afterwards, I thank Dr. Somnath Barure for this a complete lecture on the Unit 3. It included all the topics of background and the 4 poems each of the 2 poets who are prescribed for the detailed study, Seamus Heaney and Philip Larkin. So, Sir was having was not keeping well in the last week, but still he could somehow manage in spite of uh, his health and the busy schedule. He could do it on time, and I'm sure that the students will be largely benefited with from this presentation. So I thank sir once again and declare that the session is over. Thank you.
Thank you.
A lot.